Hey everyone, my name is Antonio Reid. I'm with the Rising Tide Association with the Environmental Coffeehouse. Today I want to do a report on the Intergovernmental Panel Climate Change Report on 1.5 and what 1.5 in the report means for us. I wanted to first start off by talking about what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is and its purpose. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the United Nations body tasked with understanding the temperature targets of 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius and what it takes to obtain these. They are not supposed to be a political body, so they do not come up with any type of policy recommendation, but they explain the science as achieving the policy goals. So the IPCC came out with their first report in 1990, definitively declaring for the human scientific consensus that our CO2 emissions produced by industrial civilization were causing our planet to warm. At the time, they were projecting that we might reach somewhere between 1 to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. One thing that I wanted to talk about, because I think there's been a lot of confusion, is what does the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change mean by achieving 1 degree, 2 degree? What does that mean in what context? They use the context of a baseline, the pre-industrial baseline. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change uses the 1880 baseline. That's what they say is pre-industrial. The scientists at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change don't use 1880 because it's convenient. They use it because we have a much higher level of confidence in the temperature record dating back to 1880 as opposed to 1750, understanding that true pre-industrial is in fact closer to 1750 than it is 1880. So that's the general understanding. And so that is the mark that climate scientists look at when they do climate projections, temperature rise projections into the future. So briefly, a history on what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has achieved for us and what they've said about the state of climate. Again, they released their first assessment, the AR1, in 1990, definitively stating that it was our CO2 greenhouse emissions that were increasing the planet's global average temperature. They won the Nobel Prize in 2007 with their B1 scenario, predicting that we would reach anywhere between 1 degree, 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. A lot of reports have come out since then regarding how we can get to 2 degrees Celsius. What does it mean to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, and if it's possible to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius. Of course, the main focus on this new report is what will it take for us, humanity, to stay below or to achieve the 1.5 goal, and I wanted to go over that and clarify what that really means. The first thing is one of the main differences in this report is emphasizing what we didn't emphasize, or what the IPCC didn't emphasize in 2013, and that is what are the regional impacts of global warming. The 2013 fifth assessment mainly focused on general global warming as a global phenomenon and the impacts globally. If you look into the deep chapters, there's a lot of research that was beginning to unfold on the regional impacts. This one does focus on what the regional impacts of 1.5 degrees Celsius are. And that's namely that you're going to find increased warming in places like the high north, the Arctic. We've seen that in Arctic amplification. But we also are going to expect enormous amounts of warming over parts of Siberia, Greenland, Canada, and the United States as well. And in fact, for every degree Celsius that we warm, we expect the mid regions to warm almost half as quick as that. So 2 degrees Celsius essentially could spell a world that's 3 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer for the United States as a whole. And so the report kind of specializes and looks into what are the regional impacts, North America, Europe, the mid-latitudes, equatorial regions, and the poles of 1.5. One of the things that I wanted to highlight about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is this assessment. What is the main difference? The main difference is, I think, in 2007, like I say, they were originally predicting 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And every assessment, they've actually moved that scale up. So we moved from 2100 reaching 2 degrees Celsius to now moving about 2050 and 2013. And now in 2018, the scientists say that we could breach the 1.5 degree Celsius mark as early as 2030, which would be absolutely devastating and catastrophic. The time range for that, they say, is 2030 to 2052, best case scenario with the current track. And that's if the IPCC is clear that we cannot achieve now the 1.5 degree Celsius mark without massive cuts in our CO2 emissions, and we begin achieving negative emissions targets. A lot of people find what the IPCC is saying is alarming or cutting edge, but I do also want to be clear that what the IPCC is saying today is, I think we have to understand this, that the IPCC is one of the most conservative scientific organizations on the planet. And so likewise, so too are their results. They have a conservative process, a conservative methodology, and likewise, they get conservative results. And to highlight that difference, I want to talk about a report that the International Energy released in 2010, almost now a decade ago. This is what they have to say about the so-called 2 degree, 1.5 degrees Celsius target. They say the pathway to 2 degrees Celsius is very tough. The road to 1.5, and this is in the words of the International Energy Agency, the road to 1.5 goes through uncharted territory. The transformation required for a reasonable chance at 1.5 is stark, requiring radical. And these are policymakers and scientists at the International Energy Agency. Again, a very, very conservative body, and they're using the word radical to explain what we need to do in order to be in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius. Radical near-term reductions in the energy sector emissions, employing, and they finish off by saying, employing every known technological, societal, and regulatory decarbonation option available. That's what you get from one of the most conservative bodies in the international order today. That in order to keep to 1.5, we have to employ every single known technological, societal, and regulatory decarbonation option available. This is literally the scientists scrambling at this point. And I do want to bring our viewers' attention. This is not in 2018. This report was released by the International Energy Agency World Outlook in 2010. This was their assessment and how we might get to 1.5. I also wanted to highlight that right now we are facing what's being called political paralysis in the United States on the issue of climate change. The Republican Party has come out and said the science is not real, that CO2 has no effect on the atmosphere, and if it does have an effect, it's not something that we have to worry about. We've seen the oil industry capture the EPA. We've seen ExxonMobil capture the Secretary of State office, and I actually didn't expect to see that in my lifetime, but it in fact did happen. And so in the United States, we've been living in an oil fluff dystopia where we deny science. But the United States has actually been responding or working toward a massive response to climate change. Both the Democrat Party and the Republican Party have been working toward climate change, and it's been a consensus in both parties that our emissions are causing the climate to change. The climate is changing, and there are going to be very real and significant and civilizational impacts. And according to the Age of Consequences 2007 assessment from the Center of International Strategic Studies, these impacts would manifest themselves in and around the time of 2040. They have three mainline scenarios. I want to go over those now. And also keep in mind what the IPCC is saying about 1.5 degrees Celsius above 1880 by 2030. So one of the think tanks in the defense arenas, it says their first scenario is called the expected scenario. That's 1.3 degrees Celsius by 2040. Their severe scenario is 2.6 degrees Celsius by 2040, and the catastrophic scenario is 5.6 degrees by 2100. When they calculated their scenarios, they were not using an 1880 baseline, they were using a 1990 baseline. So 1 degree now moves up to 2 degree, 2.6 degree moves up to 3.2, and 5.6 moves up to 6.2 degrees Celsius. We got to remember who are the people who are authoring the Age of Consequences. If you've heard the name John Podesta, he's the former advisor to the Clinton White House. He's the former campaign manager for the Hillary Rodham Clinton campaign 2016, and he's the former transition chief for the Obama White House. He's the lead author, and here's what he says. In 2007, that the United States security apparatus should expect no less, than 2 degrees Celsius by 2040. And it is likely that we'll breach 3.2 degrees Celsius. And I want to focus in on why John Podesta and his team thinks that we're actually going to reach 3.2 degrees Celsius, more than twice what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is predicting for 2030, just 10 years later in 2040. He says that in the severe scenario, they begin to factor in and try to quantify feedbacks. One of the feedback loops that they look at is actually something that we all think is new today, and that's the jet stream manipulation caused by the Arctic amplification feedback. Well, early reports were coming out as early as 2007 that John Podesta and his team were aware about, that the breakdown of the jet stream system would allow warm air to leak into the Arctic. His team also tried to quantify, or they began to quantify, what it would mean if we saw large melts in the permafrost region and methane hydrates in the Arctic as well. These type of large-scaled feedbacks, and of course the loss of our Arctic albedo, these type of large-scaled feedback would begin to really cause a dramatic increasing temperature rise effect in years 2020, 2030, and through 2040. They conclude that we are likely to see the end of the international system. That's institutions like the United Nations, NATO, by 2040. That we are going to see more countries fall into a rogue state or a failed state as opposed to an independent sovereign state. For this section, I just wanted to move into my own personal thoughts on the data that we are getting, what appears to be almost every day now. I think what the IPCC report should mean for everyone is that this is truly a wake-up call. We don't just face catastrophe, we are in the middle of one. We have to act now urgently and drastically. From this point on, it does only get worse. And I have to call out people like Robert Scribbler on his YouTube channel, Because I want to be very clear in the messaging of climate change that this is not just a topic for scientists. This is a topic for every single person that breathes air and drinks water and lives on the face of the planet. What we are engaged in today is an extreme, out of control experiment. Our planet for the rest of our lives will be gradually warming. If you have a child today, you will not be able to connect to them on the issue of seasons. They will never experience seasons as you did before. Essentially, the world you were born into is now forever lost. We cannot get it back through geoengineering. We cannot get it back through carbon dioxide removal. We cannot get it back through solar radiation management. We cannot get it back through putting mirrors in space and reflecting sunlight. We have lost an enduring, or what might have been an enduring aspect of who we are. For as long as our species remembered, there had been 4 routine and reoccurring seasons. That entire dynamic has changed. You don't have to be a scientist to understand what it means to live in a 1 degree warmer world. All you have to do is go outside. We are seeing the effects arrive every single day. One of the things that I think that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment highlights is that there is no safe level of warming. 1.5 degrees Celsius is not a safe level of warming. Today, at 1 degree Celsius, we are seeing record heat waves. The country, the plan, has seen so many heat waves just this summer, and typhoons back to back. They are calling it a natural disaster. We're seeing low-leveled island nations evacuating. We're seeing deserts spread. We are seeing the greatest wildfires that we have on record. We're seeing flooding events, 1 in 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years happening repeatedly. We just saw in 2017 the cost for natural disasters of $300 billion, the cost of the last decade. At the UN, Antonio Guterres says that our world is in chaos. I think that for the people at home, we have to take a moment and think about not what did the next 100 years mean for us, but what does the next 5 years mean for us? What does the next 10 years mean for us? What does the next 20 years mean for us and our children? Right now, we already face a calamity in Europe, a refugee crisis greater than World War II. Even according to the Age of Consequences report, we are expecting by 2040 nearly 30 million refugees. That's 300% greater than the crisis we've seen from Syria. So at this point, I want to open the floor to anyone who's out there for questions about the IPCC report, questions about 1.5 degrees Celsius, or questions about regional impacts of climate change, or any other questions related to the topic.
Can you see the questions? Or should I read them?
Can you, do you mind reading them to me? Because I can't.
Patrick McNulty, only ocean mechanical thermal energy conversion gets it back. Do you know about Patrick's invention?
Yes, I'm very I won't say familiar, but I've been exposed to the MTEC. Um, at this point, I would say I'm willing to try anything. I mean, you have people like Dr. Greg Marlin, who's a former co-author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2007, advocating for putting mirrors in space to reflect sunlight. Um, but I think we have to realize that we're not going to have a technical solution to this, because it's more, what we are facing is more than a carbon problem. What we are doing is assaulting the entire biosphere. The atmosphere is just one byproduct of our assault. And it was one of the things that gave way first. Um, so to me, I think we do have to get carbon out of the atmosphere. We have to move rapidly away from fossil fuels, but we have to think about this in its totality.
I have another question. Marcia Quinn-Noren. The dramatic increase in methane and CO2 being released as the Arctic melts will not be stopped or reversed by our cutting greenhouse emissions, correct?
That absolutely has to be correct, because we've already seen, I think it was dated back in 1990 from the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases, that if we were to achieve, even on regional levels, of a temperature rise of 1 degree Celsius above the pre-industrial level, that we would elicit rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses causing major ecosystem damage. One of the ecosystem damages we see in the Arctic, which is warming somewhere between 2 to 5 times faster than the global average, depending on what part of the season, we see rapid permafrost thaw already at a global average of 1 degree Celsius. And I think also a part of this conversation that we're missing is the fact that even if we did cut our emissions today all the way down to zero, we have at least 0.3 to 0.5 of a degree Celsius in the pipeline. So at this point, we are going to achieve 1 degree Celsius, 1.5 degrees Celsius. I genuinely do think we're going to achieve that no matter what we do. And then if you add global dimming on top of that, it seems clear to me that 1.5 is really unavoidable. And really, for that matter, so is 2 degrees Celsius. And by the my best understanding of the science, 1.5, 2 degrees C are not stopgaps. You cannot stop the climate changing at 1.5, 2 degrees Celsius. Those are unstable states. The planet is going to race with this type of forcing behind it to the next stable state. 1.5 degrees Celsius is not stable, nor is 2. And even if they were stable states, they wouldn't be at the rapidity that we're reaching them. Maybe if we were achieving 2 degrees Celsius over the course of hundreds or thousands of years, but we're achieving it in decades.
Merrill says, we cannot stop it. Is there anything we can do, either slow it down somewhat or to lessen the pain as we go down?
That's the only thing we can do. That's the only thing that we can do positive. There's certainly the forces that we're looking at now will live on beyond us, much, much further beyond us. We have changed the course of not only human history, but planetary history for some time. What we can do is we can have efforts of mass disobedience. Taking meat out of our diet is very important. I think it's important for several reasons. We basically have an animal holocaust happening every day. Secondly, we can rebel against the fossil fuel infrastructure in any way that we can. Protest at your universities, demand they divest, cut your use of fossil fuels in any measurable way that you know how to. Talk to your neighbor, get out in your street, plant a garden. One thing that I think we absolutely have to do is build communities at this time. Rogue individuals who pull themselves up by the bootstraps aren't going to do it. The only thing that's going to have any type of chance of mitigating the harm, the impact, the suffering, is us coming together in communities, community farming, community jobs, community development. I think that's what we can do as individuals. What we can do on the national level is different. Right now, we have a Republican Party that absolutely refuses to admit that science is real. But this isn't new. Ronald Reagan came to the White House, ripped solar panels off the White House to prove that science wasn't real. We have George W. Bush. His response to climate change was to bomb Iraq. But the Democrats are practically no better. What did Bill Clinton do? He left the issue of Kyoto to George W. Bush. Very similarly, that Obama left the issue of Paris to Trump. Both of the Democratic presidents expanded fossil fuel development. Fracking exploded under the Obama era. Natural gas and oil production increased by 88% under the Obama era. So it's not just about getting Republicans out of office, but it's actually getting people who understand the crisis and who won't put anything first but the crisis. So on the national level, there's a lot to do, like I say. One thing that we absolutely have to do is radically transform our energy sector. And this is going to bring a lot of jobs to the United States. We've been deindustrialized by Wall Street and the Clinton thugs, but we can radically build our infrastructure to create dignified paying jobs across the United States that would affect us. We need to radically transform our transportation sector, producing jobs in that arena. There's a lot to be done. And in fact, some people say we have a population crisis or problem, and we do. But really, there aren't enough hands at this point to do what needs to be done on the climate front. And of course, if anyone has more questions, I'm willing to take those as well.
Okay, let's see. I have one from Torstein, and he asks, Tony, do you think IPCC will ever be shut down? Example, because too many of us now see through their conservative lies?
I don't want to call the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I don't want to say they're engaged in some type of conspiracy, and that's why I try to dispel this notion about why they use the 1880 baseline as opposed to 1750. They use 1880 because we can be more certain about temperature averages at that time due to the reliability of measurements. Every scientist at the IPCC knows that we didn't begin industrial civilization in 1880. But we can just get better numbers from 1880. Dr. Mann and his group has been working on climate reconstruction, and they've done a lot in that way. But I think the range that you get, even from Dr. Mann's work, is somewhere between 0.02 degrees Celsius and 0.3 degrees Celsius additional temperature rise on the 1880 level. But to me, that's such a large range, and that's the same thing that the IPCC is confronted with. Here's what I think you should take from the IPCC. This is what we know absolutely is basically going on in the climate arena, right? This is climate science one-on-one. Okay, if the IPCC is saying it, then yeah, of course that's true, right? It's absolutely true, for example, that CO2 is warming the planet. It's absolutely true that 2 degrees Celsius is dangerous. We know that. But to have the IPCC, the most conservative, I mean, that's like having Mitch McConnell finally coming out and saying that climate change is dangerous. So we got the IPCC. Oh my God, all the scientists in the world are coming to finally to say what we already know, because we can go outside and look and see how dangerous it is. And they're finally coming to say, yeah, this is dangerous, it's getting bad. And I wanted to point out the fact that it's actually more helpful to realize that they are so conservative, because they are crossing their T's and dotting their I's. And the people who are doing that have abandoned 2100 as this date for catastrophe. Okay, we're getting as close as 2030, and you really don't want these guys to get any closer than 2030, because that really does mean we're out there.
Well, Torstein says that's not what the IPCC was supposed to do. They were supposed to warn us, not say all's fine.
Actually, but the IPCC has been warning us. They told us for a very, very long time. You got to remember, 2 degrees Celsius is a huge, huge, huge level of warming for the Earth. They've been warning us since at least 1990 that we were headed for catastrophe in somewhere between 110 years from then. So they've been I think they've been on the ball, but we've been ignoring them. And now at this late stage, people want to say, well, they should have been yelling louder. I don't know what else the IPCC could have been saying. Then we have to rapidly, again, I just quoted from the IEA, which I know is not the IPCC, but it comes from the same cloth. And they say that it would require a radical transformation in our society to reach these emissions, and that we have to employ every technological, societal, and regulatory decarbonization option possible to achieve these goals. These are people who went to school to get PhDs, okay? They're cut from a different cloth. But this is the biggest scream and yell that you're going to get from them.
Carrie says, yes, the climate scientists are finally telling the truth.
Well, I mean, I think the climate scientists have been telling the truth all along. I think they've been saying that our CO2 emissions are warming the planet. I think they've been saying that, of course, this has to be dangerous by all account. I think they've been saying that, if we don't cut our emissions drastically and soon, that we would be facing catastrophe. I think what the scientists have been doing is they want to be cautious about how soon we would reach catastrophe. And like I say, every single report, we see that they're getting closer and closer. I mean, 2030 is only really 12 years away. Excuse me, less than 20 years away. So we're really facing, it's not like we have a lot of time to act on this.
Well, Torstein says, no, they're not far from it about climate scientists.
And I'm sure when they come out with their 6th assessment, we're going to find that the catastrophe limit has moved closer to the present. Because, of course, we are in abrupt climate change, an episode of abrupt climate change now. So we're going to find year on, year out, that things are going to happen faster than expected. The IPCC, even with their most latest report, they're already behind. Okay, so.
Well, Torstein said IPCC said on Sunday we'll have ice-free summers only once per century at 1.5 C warming. That's pure BS.
Like I say, this is the most conservative body on the issue of climate change in the world. So you're going to get statements like that. And like I say, that means every single assessment it's going to be more and more dire every single assessment. You have people like Peter Wadhams who are saying that we're going to get an ice-free Arctic by the summer of 2025 at the latest, at the absolute latest, maybe as early as 2020. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for your questions. And thank you for allowing me to do this report on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's special report on 1.5. Thank you, Antonio Reid from the Environmental Coffeehouse.